that right now.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from today. We want to thank you for joining this TechStrong learning experience with Harness. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. This session is being recorded. It will be available afterward on demand, and we are going to send you a link to the recording once we conclude. On the left side of your screen, you'll see that we've got some resources for you in the handout section, or the handouts in the resource section, I'm sorry. Go ahead and click those, download those, check those out at any time throughout the presentation. We're also going to have some polls for you, so make sure that you stick around for those. We'll also leave those open. They should be on the left side of your screen as they pop up as well. Again, we've got some great polls. Make sure you check those out. On the right side of your screen, you'll see that there is a chat section. Anything that you want to share with us, your experiences, your comments, your understanding, go ahead and use the chat. We do want to hear from you. We want to engage with you, so we'd love for you to utilize that, and at least tell us where you're tuning in from. Below the chat, you may have to scroll down. We've got the Q&A section. Any questions that you've got, we want to make sure that you put them in the Q&A section so that we can answer those towards the end of the program. And if we're not able to get to them in our allotted time, we'll make sure to reach out to you after the program ends. Let's go ahead and kick off today's topic. You're not overspending, you're undersaving. And I'm joined with Benjamin Linares, and FinOps specialist at Harness, and Robin Elliott, principal engineer at Harness. Benjamin, Robin, thank you for joining us. Go ahead and take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Jared. Appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ben Linares, and I am a FinOps specialist at Harness. I'm joined today with Robin Elliott, who is a solutions architect. And today we're going to talk about FinOps. More specifically, why the idea around you're not overspending, you're undersaving came about. I first mentioned that back at the FinOps X conference in June of this year. And the idea was something that came through my own work as a practitioner. And it really came down to, it's not that we're having conversations around overspending, but we're not seeing these changes in the dollar amounts. And where it came down to was, wow, we're not really overspending. We're kind of undersaving, and we can show that. And so that's where the whole premise around this became more of a, the conversations keep going around. Why does cloud spend keep going up? Well, not necessarily always going up. It's, again, that fact that you're not capturing the savings and you're not able to find what that looks like. But before I go on, I want to give my partner here, Robin, a chance to speak himself. Robin.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Robin Elliott here. Nice to have everyone on the call. Looking forward to the conversations we're going to have and interactions. I'll be doing a little bit of a demo and also interacting throughout this session. Been involved with FinOps for a little bit over 3.5 years, interacted with many different customers. So looking forward to it. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Robin. So just a little bit of background, if you don't know who I am. I've been in infrastructure for nearly my entire career. I've been doing technology for about 28 years. I've worked for some amazing companies like Kaiser Permanente, Amazon, and Starbucks. It was at Starbucks where I helped lift and build the FinOps department, creating an opportunity to where we were saving 8 figures annually, and we got our forecasting within about 1 to 1.5%. So we saw a lot of success standing up the department, but it was a challenge, right? If you're in FinOps, you know this. Getting people to act, getting people to go and do what needs to be done can be an incredibly challenging thing because you're asking somebody to do more work. And that's where FinOps really comes in and bridges that gap of being able to say, hey, listen, let us help you understand what savings looks like, what automation could be put into play, as well as what actions you'll want to consistently repeat. Because in order to get to the place of really seeing savings, you have to have big goals, right? But the goals themselves are not enough. You have to have a system of repeatable, consistent activities that get you there. And this is just a growing process. And I will say one of the neat statistics that I heard this last June at the FinOps X conference was, I think it was 2023, 9 out of the Fortune 100 companies had a FinOps department. As of June, it was 94 of the top Fortune 100 companies. So it's clear to see that companies are taking this seriously and really wanting to understand how do they maximize the value out of their investments. And so you're going to hear a lot of that because that's what the business understands. Engineering has its own language, but the business does too, along with finance. And the idea in FinOps is that we all come together for the common goal of optimizing and getting the maximum value out of our investments. So with that being said, let's continue. Drift. Now, I see drift as that capability, as you see here, is you've got everything from tag drift, architecture drift, commitment drift. The idea is if you're not getting the highest value, you're starting to drift. Zero drift FinOps turns cloud behavior into predictable, controlled, value-generating motion. That means that when you're setting up commitment buys, capacity buys, when you're implementing automation, the idea is these are consistently monitored and reviewed to ensure you're getting the highest value. Highest value, for example, is if you have a commitment and that commitment is a 3-year long reserved instance. Let's say you're only getting 60, 50% utilization out of that. You're not seeing the value that you need. Therefore, you have to go and understand, should I make an exchange? Should I downgrade? There's all sorts of different things that need to be done. Typically at the engineering level, sometimes at the infrastructure billing level. But if you're going to ask for a change in architecture, design, assets themselves, then you're going to engage engineering. And engineering is the teams that are definitely going to be the ones to have a say in this. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and toss it to Robin real quick, because Robin, again, has been with Harness for quite a few years, and he's had that ability to get exposure to so many customers. We have over 900 enterprise customers. I don't know if Robin's met with all of them, but I know he's met with a lot of them. And so, Robin, I would just love to hear from you when you think about drift and how companies are addressing it, or even if they are addressing it, what does that mean to you?
I think as a foundational pillar, especially with FinOps, tags are always important. So it's always interesting to see the different variation and maturity levels of where organizations are with tags. Obviously, the people with less tagging or accurate tagging in place, how you approach to actually fixing that, varies greatly. I mean, a lot of it, I think, boils down to executive sponsorship and ownership. So sometimes it's the big stick approach. I've actually seen like whole information technology groups almost actually get told, hey, you're going to spend 1 week of this 2-week sprint going out fixing the tagging within your environment. That would be a sort of excessive case where, tagging is probably about 55% accurate or omitted. But, other things as well. When we talk about architectural commitment drift, making sure that people are actually utilizing, the right commitments and the right instance families and the right regions that, FinOps has planned for and actually bought into, and making sure that the communication of what people should be using is there, and you're detecting that drift when people are not taking advantage of those, savings vehicles that you've bought into.
Absolutely. You know what, Robin, you brought up a great point. Boy, tagging is foundational. If I could think about all the conversations I've had where anywhere from, smaller companies to large Fortune top 5 companies all have this challenge. And one that seems to be the one that resonates most is retro tagging, right? Anything net new you can usually catch, but it's that retro tagging that becomes a problem. And if you can't tell who's spending what where, you're in a challenging place. But that being said, I'm going to give a statistic that shows just how challenging this really is. So 37% of companies, enterprise companies, can only do tagging at 80% or greater for showback. That is a very low number. 37% of companies, enterprise companies, are able to show a greater than 80% showback. That means that there's still quite a bit out there that is untagged, unallocated, and that right there becomes waste. And that'll be a topic as we get down the road, but that tagging is so essential. I have to say that most organizations that I know are able to do this well, they use rule-based retro tagging to clean up the past, not the people, right? The idea is we want to scoop those assets, find out where they should be. And, when you use a tool like Harness, you have that ability to look at for the resource groups, naming conventions, subscription account metadata, Kubernetes namespace, infrastructure's code modules, deployment pipelines. There is a really unique way, and that's one of the things that I found to be so different, having conducted so many RFIs at Starbucks, looking at over 40 to 50 different companies that all help in this space, that this was the number one thing that is important to get right. Because without the proper tagging, everything else kind of falls to the wayside. You can't really do auto stopping, which saves massive amounts of money. You can't really do a whole lot of things because you rely on that tagging structure, that whole foundation. So, Robin, I think you hit that nail on the head. And I think that tagging is definitely a great conversation. And I think it's a bigger conversation. And I've had some papers where I've had customers who wanted to understand, what's our approach? What should we look like? And honestly, it really does come down to understanding where you're at, setting up the rule-based retro tagging so that you can start capturing all of those and start aligning them to the right business unit, team, application. It becomes incredibly important to do that. So I think you brought up a really good point there. So let's move on. Savings are systems, not events. AI right sizing, guardrails, commitment automation, anomaly prediction. Real savings don't come from the dashboards, right? They come from systems that never sleep. The idea is you want to have a system that is continuously reviewing and looking over your assets to understand, are you getting the most out of these investments? And again, we talk about what the business looks for. The business wants to understand, if I'm spending X amount of dollars, am I getting the most for those X amount of dollars? Because nowadays it is really challenging to have those budgets, and every department and leader is looking to cut in certain areas. And when you have 28 to 35% waste in the cloud, right there, you have an opportunity to capture dollars that will help with other projects, that will help company with initiatives that they may not be able to fund right now. And in some cases, maybe it even has impact over attrition. I think the idea is you need to be able to have something that's working for you. If you do this manually, and I know this from experience, it is an overwhelming task. Starbucks had over hundreds of commitments, hundreds and hundreds. To manually ensure that every one of those are getting the highest value can be a real challenge. Therefore, when you have tools and you have opportunities to employ different kinds of solutions that actually do that for you, there is tremendous value. And I'm going to stop right there, Robin, and just get your take on things like commitment orchestrators and what kind of value that you feel they bring.
Yeah, I mean, I think just for Jared's benefit, I think we've got a poll on this, so we might want to kick off a couple of those polls whilst we're talking here. But yeah, commitment, very interesting. Obviously, it's a great savings vehicle that the cloud vendors give you, but it does take time, effort, and foundational knowledge on how best to use them. And most environments or customers that I work with, they don't have the luxury of having a steady state environment for that long. So there's the question of, how often are you actually having to go back and put that work in? And are you still at the stage of maturity where you're having to do everything in spreadsheets and you're exporting data, out of Cost Explorer or whatever, having to put it in spreadsheets, figure out, well, what am I actually going to do next month, when the savings plan expires, or how can I increase my coverage? I recently worked with a utility company that covers a couple of states, and they're only at 50% coverage of their RDS, and that's based on hours. If you looked at it on dollars, it's far lower. And it's because they're manually actually having to go and engage with the individual database teams, and it's just time and effort, and they just don't have enough hours in the week or the month to get their coverage up because they're trying to tackle it from a purely manual approach.
And that can be really challenging, right? I mean, even if it's a centralized technology organization, it can be a challenge. Now, imagine if it's a decentralized. And that's what I saw back at Starbucks was we were highly decentralized. Teams were, doing their own thing, had their own responsibilities, and independently made decisions. So when we stood up FinOps, one of the most challenging things was we wanted to make sure we had some control over that. We wanted to make sure that we could, at the tenant level, start making those acquisitions so that they weren't doing it at member level in a way that we couldn't get the full value out of these assets. And that was a challenge in itself. The idea was, again, centralizing those purchases and making sure that we're covering the vast amount of assets to get the highest value out of them. And there's a lot that can be done there. There are opportunities not only to save with RIs, which are huge, but additional savings plans, additional capacity buys. There's quite a bit out there that really will help you save money. But one of the things that I find interesting, and I had a conversation around this, and it was with the leader, and one of the leaders was talking about, you got to make these things tied to what's important to them, right? And for leaders, it's going to come down to, I'll call it utilization, but it's really going to be value. What you pay for, am I getting the value for it? If I'm not getting the value for it, then what am I doing here? And so you tie these things to money, not mortality, right? So you look at things like when we want to connect it to a dollar, how do we reduce the other spend? And how do we make, chargeback accurate? How do we accelerate forecasting? How do we unlock policy automation? These kind of things can help enable a 20 to 35% waste reduction. And if you think about it, if you're spending, let's say 100 million in the cloud, 35% is a incredible number to think about a wasted amount of money. That is quite a bit. And like I said, these things could have impact on projects, different initiatives. There's so much opportunity to be found when you're able to reduce and really mitigate waste. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities in there, but I also think that it comes from an entire holistic approach. Your commitments are only one way. Your tagging is only the foundation in one way. There are so many different ways in which you can do this to look for things like idle services. You can look for things like, because again, dashboards will show you current state, but what are you doing to mitigate these things? And this is where automation really comes into play. This is where you can see and understand how that kind of automation will help save you money. Value engineering core. Cost per booking, we talk about things like unit metrics, right? Cost per deployment. Engineering tends to own economics, and finance owns the innovation. Here's what I mean by that. Finance has an idea of spend, and they want to know, why is it going up, or where can we save money? But the execution or the action piece is owned by engineering. They're the ones who are going to act. And the idea is you want them to understand why they should act. And one of the challenges I saw in the beginning of my FinOps journey was, if you take an engineer a bunch of information, but you don't really give them enough information, for example, you haven't done the due diligence, you haven't done the work to really understand the work that's involved in making a change, you're just asking them to do more work. What I found is a mature FinOps organization will bring the value as well as the recommended change. So it's not just, hey, we'd like you to downgrade or change your scale set from 30 to say 9, or, and here's the data to show you why you should do this. Because a lot of times engineers are planning for the spike. They're planning to ensure that there is no user impact. And I've said this before and I stand by it. Application developers build for reliability, availability, and performance. They're not necessarily building for optimization. They want you to have a good experience. However, that good experience can sometimes come at a cost. And there are times in which it's not necessary to have maybe the SKU that they originally selected, i.e., here comes a FinOps to say, you could change that SKU. You could change these things around. Now, from a unit economics perspective here, talking about cost per booking, cost per customer, the idea is you have all of your data. How do you slice and dice it? How do you show the engineering economics themselves? Well, the idea is you want to start with your service tiers. And if you have that capability and your tagging is strong, you then can show business unit, application. You can give visibility in different ways rather than just holistic numbers. And I know this again because we started at Starbucks doing big numbers, and then we got better at getting closer to the technology itself, all the way down to the SKUs, so that we were able to enable engineers to really make good, positive change. And what I mean by that was one of the dashboards we had, it's called the Bean Counter. And the Bean Counter would allow you to, yesterday and going back historically, look to see what you spent on your subscription, whether it's prod, non-prod, connected, disconnected. You can go and see, based upon that application, what you spent. And you can even go and see by the SKU. Now, the reason why this was important, and I learned this, I got this from years ago when I was listening to Tim O'Brien from Walmart speak back in 2023. He brought up a point about the same kind of thing, giving the engineers a SKU level. And my leader was there with me at the conference, and I leaned over and I said, you know what, we created a report just like that about 6 months ago. And the idea was we really need to get this into the engineers' hands. So we started promoting that. We started making sure that the engineers had the capability to understand at the SKU level what their spend was, as well as pull back and see what it was at a overall storage level or an overall virtual machine level. But the idea is to give them enough information so that if you're making a recommendation to change, that they understand the current posture of their SKU, as well as the recommendation you're making and the impact that that would have. Again, FinOps should be enabling engineering as well as communicating at the same time with finance to help finance understand, here are the changes we're looking to make, and here's the impact that we expect. And engineering, here's what the change should look like from your perspective, and here's what you can anticipate in these changes themselves. This is where FinOps brings everybody to the table, all the personas, to have that kind of conversation and to be able to lead them down the pathways where you see saving, under savings dies. So now everybody's on the same page. Everybody's looking to go in the same direction. And this is a repeatable model. It doesn't matter the team you're working with. They may have different SKUs, but there's still opportunity there. So when they come to the table to work with their FinOps department, they're going to have far more success than trying to independently go out on their own, because FinOps will enable them to see these things. They'll also enable them to potentially find discounts that they may be unaware of. And that was some things that we had at Starbucks. We worked out discounts that allowed us to compound the savings for, say, virtual machines. So there was really neat opportunities there, but that's why you really want to work with your FinOps. Your engineering teams and your finance teams should be working with FinOps to really help vet those things out. Robin, anything from you on that?
I think communication and education is key, as you said, Ben. Probably the what's the expression? FinOps oops that I encountered at one organization was just a lack of education within the engineering group about how savings work within the cloud. So I actually went to this team that owned a bunch of Kubernetes clusters and basically said, hey, I've got this optimization for you. The system generated all the facts. It made the recommendation, and it basically said you should reconfigure this cluster, and it's going to save you $50,000 a year. Okay. And I was a little bit gobsmacked with the first response to that, which was, well, why would we do that? Because it costs us nothing. And I was like, sorry. Can you explain this comment that it costs us nothing? And it said, well, it appears at $0 on our bill. And so after a couple of quick conversations, it's like, yes, that's because it's covered by a savings plan. But do you know how a savings plan works? And the fact that as an organization, you still have spend that's over and above the savings plan that's not being covered by any discount, right? And so if we can actually make this configuration change for you, and let's talk about it more from the technology perspective, making sure there's not going to be an impact, what that does is it frees up the savings plan to do additional coverage on this on-demand stuff up here. And as a company, we save money. So, never assume, the level of knowledge and whether or not people truly understand what is, a savings plan, an RI, on-demand versus spot, all the terminology that we're used to, how it actually, really works from a financial perspective.
100%, Robin. You're absolutely right, and that's interesting because I had a call earlier this morning with one of our customers, and that was really kind of the gist of the conversation. Like, I don't think leadership really understands, and it requires leadership support. That's one of the things at Starbucks that was surprising to me. We had leadership support, but for a long time they were like, we don't really understand what FinOps is or does, but you guys are saving money, and that's a good thing. So what we recognize is we need to educate people on who we are and what FinOps does, because you're right, Robin, a lot of times they don't know. And the foundation was formed back in 2019, so it's been 6 years. It's not like the practices of saving money and optimizing have been around for a while. DevOps has been using it for a while, but the actual true foundation and formation of it all, still very new, still very young. But yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think it's important because some of the conversations I have now is just, I can't get leadership to support what I'm trying to do. And I always say the greatest way to get support is to show the opportunities there are to save. For example, if you can see what teams are acting and showing active savings, that's a great thing to float up to the top, as well as the opportunities that are still available. However, something that I've seen getting leaders to start acting upon is when you show waste, compounded waste. Last month, you could have saved $10,000. You didn't do this change. Next month, you're going to be now at 20,000, and it's going to keep growing as you keep moving forward if you don't make any change. And that's something that I was talking about yesterday with a customer. If you want to really gain the support of your leadership, show the amount of waste that can be captured, that it just needs action. And I say this because at Starbucks, we had an opportunity with one team, and this team had over $500,000 opportunity for savings. And it was something so simple, so easy. So many times I think we convolute it and think it's going to be hard, it's going to be a challenge. This was one of those rare billing level changes where there's zero impact to infrastructure, and it was enabling Azure Hybrid Benefit. holy cow, when you enable that, which is a couple of clicks, it takes a few seconds, you now see an incredible, like I said, over $500,000 savings. Now that team was really interested in working with us because they saw what we brought to the table and how it had zero impact to the infrastructure, but all upside as well as far as the billing. So sometimes those wins can be very small and minute by way of the level of effort. And sometimes they can be something major. Like, for example, you want to change an express route gateway. Well, if you're asking to tear down an express route gateway and then go rebuild in Terraform, there is some effort. You will have impact. That level of effort is a lot greater than it is to, say, enable an Azure hybrid benefit. So for value engineering, the way I always looked at it is, what is the lowest hanging fruit, right? What is the thing that I can do that's going to have the least amount of effort, but the biggest impact? And that was one of those things, Azure hybrid benefit. I also think about things like unattached disks. If you've got an abandoned disk out there and they're just sitting there not doing anything, you're now just wasting money. So there should be an effort to always remediate the disks. And not every engineering team will do that. So again, that's where FinOps comes in. And, it takes trust to allow engineering for somebody else to make change, right? Engineering is very great about keeping their cloud protected, just like security. However, there comes a time when policy can help alleviate things like an abandoned disk. But what you need to do is be absolutely precise and accurate. Having an impact to an application does not earn trust. That's where putting all that effort into understanding what kind of opportunity it is, what level of effort it takes, and what would it require to execute are vastly important. And for each team, it could be very, very different. So appreciate your input there, Robin. Let's go to the next one. Cost control to value creation. Every unsaved dollar is a lost opportunity. That's so true. Every month that goes by that those savings aren't captured, you've lost that money now. And now, again, it compounds. That lost saving gets bigger and bigger. And, when you get to the end of the year, and let's say you're at even 20% of waste, that still is a very large number. And those kind of dollars can go for many, many things. So it's important to understand, why wouldn't you want to go after that? And so here's the thing, savings are pre-designed, not retrofitted. FinOps becomes growth engine, not a policing function. And that's true. The idea is we want to eliminate the waste. We want to get the highest value out of the assets. So what FinOps does is focus on that, the entire point of getting the highest value. And that value comes from understanding utilization and, again, spend. If you're not focused there, then you have to ask the question, where are you focused and what are you doing? Because there's several things that FinOps should be focused on, but eliminating waste should always be the first. The idea is getting the highest value out of your dollar. Every C-level, CTO, CEO, CFO are not going to care about, did you right-size these assets? What they're going to care about is, I saw a reduction in this opportunity. What did we do? And one of the interesting things I found at Starbucks was we weren't owning those answers in the beginning. We thought the team should own them. They know why they're not going to act on something. What was interesting is we were the ones that were sitting with the CTO office, and they had questions like, why aren't people acting upon this? So we took it upon ourselves to say, you know what, that's actually a really good question. We should own that. And so we did. We started documenting and going through and understanding so that we could have the conversation with leadership around, hey, this team can't do this right now, and here's why. However, in 2 months, they will be able to do it once they're done with this thing. Giving that kind of perspective helps leadership understand why people aren't acting. It also can help with communication. Hey, we want you to understand that this team's now doing a shift and lift over here, and they're going into a different cloud. Therefore, they can't do a capacity buy because they're only here for another 3 or 4 months. And then once they switch over, we can now reassess what that looks like. It is important to understand what your teams are doing and how they're doing it. And that value creation comes into understanding the story behind why they're doing what they're doing. The challenge is that FinOps sometimes are moving so fast that they don't have that time to really get close enough to understand that. And there is true value in being able to tell that story. So, Robin, you've met with so many companies. Again, you've had so much great experience here. When you think of that value creation statement, like what do you think about that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's always interesting. Obviously, when we're net new and introduced into a customer's environment, there's always like the legacy brownfield. But you can't keep on repeating the sins of the past. So making sure that anything that's going to be new and greenfield is designed properly and the processes are in place. Now, some of those you will garner from what you're doing on the brownfield legacy side, but yeah, it's key. And I think it does get into making sure that you're aligned with how the organization works today. So, for example, a big supermarket chain over in Asia Pacific, they're heavily into ServiceNow. Okay, so nothing happens in the environment without ServiceNow. That's how they, push everything. So being able to, have out of the box interactions with ServiceNow and our recommendation engine, actually play nice with it. Allows the teams that receive those recommendations to give that feedback. But then track it both in ServiceNow as well as the Harness dashboards. So understand, what recommendations have actually been actioned as opposed to the ratio of what have been inactioned, which of them have actually been declined, and the reasons why. Part of, like you said, it's going away in 3 months. Not worth the effort. It's very interesting. I've even had some circumstances where customers have they have different portfolios. They have their growth portfolio for applications and then their legacy, and they actually tell me, look, we got a couple of legacy applications that lose money. But we're not going to go in there and re-architect them because someone picked the wrong architecture, which is one of these things, when you're building a new application, to make sure you pick the right services, and the services are part of that cost model, so that your cost of goods is not going to be exceed the revenue you're getting against them. But they have a couple of products where that is the reverse. But they're not going to action them, because to go back and actually re-engineer and re-architect them and redeploy them on different services, it's just not worth it, because it's not in their growth portfolio. So you see a lot of different things, but you've always got a plan for net new, so that, like I said, you don't repeat those sins and inefficiencies of the past.
100%. I also think too, when I think about, and we kind of touched about this in the beginning, but when I think about things like, what's your highest ROI move in value creation, I gotta say, you know what? I go back to tagging. What you can't optimize, what you can't attribute. Say it again. You can't optimize what you can't attribute. So if you don't know who's spending this, and you've got something out there, and this does become a problem with shared services. And you know what, Robin, I'm going to tag you on this one in a second. But when you think about things like shared services, oh man, again, you have these conversations with people and trying to understand who's using a shared service and how much of it, and make sure everybody has their piece of the pie, can be an absolutely daunting task. I know early on when I had to tackle it, it was like, wow, this is just a mess. There's so much data and I need to pull through the data, and it becomes just a very, very challenging thing to be able to have that conversation. And again, I go back to the numbers around how many companies can actually see greater than 80%. It's a low number, 37%. That right there, that statistic tells you it's not being done exceptionally well right now. And it is a challenge for so many, because while net new is easy to probably capture through our policy and being able to set up the right kind of policy to capture that, the retro tagging tends to be the biggest pain. And that becomes one of those things where this, again, is foundation to your value creation. Everything should be tagged. There should not be anything out there that's not. And if it's not, there should be a remediation effort to make sure that everything is very well captured, documented, tagged, and then released. And again, when I think about shared services, that to me is one of the bigger ones. So Robin, I just want to get your take on shared services. And you know what, if you don't mind mentioning how Harness helps with that, because that was one of the things that was really impressive to me when I was on the practitioner side, and I heard you speak about it when I was at Starbucks. I thought this is a really interesting thing, because I've not really heard anybody who's doing it that well. But Robin, I'll let you speak on that.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I mean, shared services, it can be a case of, poor tagging, hygiene, etc. But there are also services that, can't be tagged. When we get to a brief demo that I'll do at the back end, I've actually got an example of, let's say, an AWS support contract. How are you actually going to proportion that out if you're in the organization where you're trying to allocate every dollar of your cloud spend? Okay, so you've got to have, the keyword there is equitable. Generally speaking, you're going to get pushback from the people receiving the bills if they don't trust it and believe it's equitable. So having the option to, not do silly things, what I would call silly things, which is like, oh, everyone gets a third, irregardless of their utilization or how much they spent in the cloud. That would be a very poor experience. Doing it proportionally, obviously, is a lot better. What I mean by that is, if you've got two teams, one spends 1 million in the cloud, the other spends 2 million, and the support contract is 30K, maybe the 1 million team gets 10K, the other team gets the 20K based on their cloud spend. That would be more proportional. But then going further than that and actually being able to do specific percentage allocation of those types of costs allows you to drive that allocation by other metrics. So, obviously I've already talked about proportional based on cloud spend, but you may actually want to consider other metrics in the equation. And that then gets into how you can actually set it based on percentages off those metrics.
And that's great, Robin. That's a great point there. And you're right. It is such a challenge, but being able to do it that way, I think you're definitely going to get closer to it. It's interesting because I think about, nothing else matters until you can trust the bill, right? I mean, how many times it's like you get the bill and it's like, do we know where all this is at? And it's like, well, tagging accuracy and full cost attribution, when you can get that to 90 to 100%, it unlocks every downstream cost reduction mechanism. I'll say that again. When you get the tagging right and you can trust the bill, it unlocks every downstream cost reduction mechanism. It's the fastest path to a meaningful dent in cloud spend within 90 days. And if you have the right kind of strategy set up, why tagging and attribution is your highest ROI move, because you can't optimize what you can't attribute. So right now you have companies that are 40 to 60% unallocated spend, shared resources with no split, unknown owners, impossible showback, forecasting guesswork, teams arguing over who owns this. These are the kind of common things that are played out in many companies. And I'm sure many companies who are listening understand, wow, this is a big challenge. And it becomes the thing that I would literally place a focus on. Like you talked about having a sprint to where you would focus just on this, 100%. This unlocks so many opportunities downstream. So thank you for that, Robin. I appreciate it. Let's move on. Zero drift. All right. So when I think about zero drift, I really have the notion that there is a way to get this down. There is a way to be so proactive that you are no longer chasing. You are now even further than zero. You've got shift left, which is being able to prohibit and proactively. Zero drift allows you to eliminate. When you embed policies and you enforce automation, when you embed this into the CI/CD process and you have infrastructure that's able to be provisioned, self-provisioned, you now take away anybody having to go and select a resource that is inappropriate for a workload, because you are setting up the right guardrails that will keep all of these workloads aligned to the right SKUs they should be using. And that to me is one of the biggest things that I've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, is that there aren't a lot of companies that are doing that out there. And to do it independently of a solution that unifies and aligns all of the developers together for a single process, to me, I thought, wow, that is where I really was attracted to Harness. And in fact, and I'll admit this now, but when I first seen Harness, I remember telling my leader, if I ever leave Starbucks, it's going to be for a company like that. They're doing it right. They're at the workload level. To me, that is exactly where FinOps should be pushing to go. It shouldn't be necessarily at we got a spike or cost anomaly and now we're going to go talk to somebody. It's already too late. You've got the cost anomaly. It's before that cost anomaly even becomes a thing that you've embedded the right guardrails, enabling all of the developers to do what they love to do, but not have to focus on the optimization. You enable them to do the work by empowering the tool to go and do all of that optimizing activities. And to me, that just really becomes the bigger picture here, is that there is capability. There seems to be a lack of focus on that. I think that FinOps has been a reactive place for so long, and that shift left has become more of a idea or notion than an activity, because it requires so much top-down support. And when I mean top-down, the leaders have to make optimization a priority. It's not just about value, it's about optimizing that value continuously, because that value is going to change. Robin, you talk about commitments, they're time bound, right? 1 year, 3 year. After a certain point, Are you going to renew? Are you getting value out of what you have? Should you be making any type of changes? All of these things are challenging for technology departments because they have to go spend more time doing all of this remediation work, all of this investment in time to understand the numbers and the data. And if they don't have a solid tool or good dashboards or good reporting or a method or way to embed policies, again, you're going to be chasing these things. And it's almost, your FinOps is going to scrape the top of what they could be savings. They might be getting that 5 to 10%, but there's quite a bit more that's they're not seeking. And to me, the idea of the zero drift theory is to ensure that you've embedded these practices from software release to infrastructure provisioning, all the way through cloud cost management, and being able to actively do things like have a commitment orchestrator that allows your commitments to be automatically managed and optimized using AI technology like we have at Harness, using the IACM infrastructure's cloud management tool, being able to provision these things and not have to worry about utilizing engineering and taking time off of their calendar. And in fact, you work with them to set this up so that it is doing exactly what they want it to do. So there are so many cool opportunities that, Robin, I'm going to take a breath and a break and then just kind of pass it over to you on that idea of zero drift and how the alignment between CI/CD, infrastructure, and CCM really kind of all play well together on the playground.
Yeah, I think I always use the analogy of horses in a stable. Engineering has control of the horses in the stable, but after they're deployed, to production and they're out in the wild, or even in lower environments, you have mini wilds. You sort of lose control somewhat potentially, and you allow an element of human drift. I mean, hopefully you're at a level of maturity where you do have governance and policy engines in place, so that during those CIDC cycles and provisioning infrastructure with IACM, etc., you've got those policies in place where people are restricted to the types of environments, types of services they can use, the instance families that are going to be aligned to the savings vehicles that FinOps has purchased. Making sure all that's in place is key. But then even going as far as putting in there blocking actual deployments because tagging's not present. So we've talked about tagging isn't like a one-day activity. You could fix tagging to 98% in an environment, and we have customers that do that. But from that point onwards, you get deviation, right? So making sure that this drift is managed and minimized, but in an automated fashion, is key. You don't want to create work. You just want to make sure that most people want to do the right thing, and if you're given the tools to do the right thing and you make it easy, then they'll do it. So that's it, man.
I think that's it. I think you're right, Robin. Given the tools, I think it's such a challenge. Having been in a formalized FinOps department, finding the right tool, I think, was always a challenge. I think where I always struggled was when I started looking at tools and bringing them to my team and having these conversations. The idea was we had to buy this whole big thing, and that was kind of hard. It's like I can only use 40, 50% of your tool, even 60%, but I can't go justify to my leaders to spend the kind of money that I want to spend on something I can't fully utilize. And that was a bigger challenge when I was looking at them. And one of the things I found to be so unique that Harness just did this last couple of months was you don't have to buy the whole tool, right? You can actually use a component in the product. I mean, Harness has over 17 products on their platform. We talked about 3, but you have that capability to say, well, I can't use auto stopping right now, but I really do need commitment orchestrator because I got a ton of commitments. Cool. You can use that piece and you just pay for that piece. To me, that blew my mind because there's nobody else that really does it that way. There's nobody else saying, oh, well, if you can't use everything, that's fine. But do you have one initiative based upon the things that we offer? And of course, there's at least one commitment orchestrator, case orchestration, auto stopping. There are so many things available that when you think about it, you can't, as a FinOps department, do it all at once. The idea is to start looking at, okay, where would we want to go to make the biggest impact? And I always thought commitment orchestrator is great because you're already saving a ton of money on your commitments. But now what if you were to get even more compounded? Let's say another 10 to 20%. That's considerably high And when you think about the time that you're giving back to the engineering team who's managing all of these, again, it's a win-win on so many levels. But I've always liked that ability to be able to buy what I need to use. I thought that was fascinating. So thank you for that, Robin. Let's go ahead and move on. FinOps enablement. So one of the things that we do that's been kind of different, that's been really, really well received, is that we do a maturity assessment. Now, this isn't based upon our perspective. This is based upon the FinOps Foundation's perspective. So we're not saying FinOps should look like this. We're saying based upon what the foundation says and the practices and the principles and the phases, we can do a maturity assessment, and we walk through this with our customers to say, here's where you're currently at. And then what we do is we offer workshops to help them expand, grow, and adopt more in their FinOps journey. And so, for example, we did one with United Airlines, and it was a wonderfully received opportunity to sit down and talk with them, understand where they wanted to go, walk them through the phases, and then align that to the business objectives they had with their leaders and create an outcome-based, time-stamped ability and initiative to then move forward. And so that was one of the things that it was one of the reasons why I left Starbucks to come to Harness, because they were taking such a different approach at helping people. And one of the things, and Robin, you've heard me say this before, FinOps is an incredible community. My heart is with the greater mission. What I did at Starbucks, I felt very thankful and grateful to be able to do, but I knew that I wanted to help more companies. I knew that I wanted to help companies figure out, how do they eliminate the waste? How do they optimize their workloads? How do they gain leadership support? It was very important for me to find a way to do that in a method or a vehicle that allowed me to have access. And I didn't know what that looked like until I started talking to folks at Harness and thought, this is a great opportunity with a great platform. The former CEO, Jody, had done some great things before with App Dynamics. He's a smart guy. He really knows where this stuff can really have impact to companies. And I love the fact that we have that opportunity to do just that. We have the opportunity to come in and help. And to me, that is one of the greatest things that I get to do today, is help companies grow, mature, develop, build their FinOps practice, because the practice itself is agnostic. It is a practice and principle that you can apply to nearly any business. And I love the fact that we're able to have these conversations with companies out there and then help them understand, here's how we can help you and here's how we can enable you. But just real quick, Robin, because I'd love for you to get to that demo here in a couple of secs. When you think about FinOps enablement, what has that been looking like for you as far as the conversations you've had with other people?
I think it's always interesting. And part of the reasons why we did this workshop was to understand, where the customer is at and meet the customer where they're at. Our customer's success is our success. Our success is not selling software, right? we want the customer to be successful with that software, for it to mature their FinOps practice, to achieve those savings so that they can be reinvested in the business. Okay. And I think, when I look at it historically, because I've literally been doing this for 3.5 years, that was a gap that we saw early on. It's like, you can't just be a software vendor. Your heart has to be in the mission. You've got to have the right support organization, aka you, Ben, Patrick, your peer, etc. Have a specialist, what we refer to as a technical account management team in our customer success org, that knows FinOps, knows the product, and actually can talk the language with our customers. And that's key. Yeah. Without that, it's like, we're just selling software, which we don't want to be in the business of.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that I think I like the most, is when I was on as a practitioner, Harness wanted to be a partner to me. They were like, come help us understand where we could get better on our product side. If there's things that you see, we'd like your feedback. And I thought, that's really cool. I love that they want to partner with me, but they want to help me get better at what I do. And that to me was a real big one. And to your point, it was a win-win, right? If I win, they win. And that's the idea, is that their approach is very much that way. And the way I see it, again, with so many products out there, from security to CI/CD to infrastructure to cloud cost, there are so many opportunities that, again, this helps unify and bring together areas of the technology department that normally work in their own silos: app dev, security, infrastructure, engineering. Everybody is so segregated to do their own thing that cohesively, when you have something that can bring them all together, specifically focused on the normalization of the release process. And not only that, I mean, I don't want to go into the whole CI/CD thing, but there is so much opportunity of what it does as well. Like I said, there's so many opportunities to optimize using some of the products that it really is a holistic change. And it's, like I said, a great partnership. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and say thank you. And I want to say real quick, if I had any advice to wrap this up before I should throw it over to Robin to do a quick demo, if you have a 90-day plan, I would say, work on your a clean 6-tag schema, a tagging guardrails, your retro tagging workflows, shared cost formulas, accountability model. Again, accountability model is a whole different thing. We also call it an ambassador program model. Maybe we'll have a webinar on that, on how to build out your ambassador program, something we're doing with some customers right now, because it is very important to have accountability and that people come to the table from different areas of the organization to be able to cohesively work together and all go in the same direction, trying to optimize the very technology that they're using. Dashboards for visibility, executive reporting pack. You got to make sure your executives see where value is coming from in all of this spend. That's what they're looking for. It's what they want to know. And then keep your KPIs to measure quarterly impact. You need to be able to, either month over month or quarterly, be able to show where that value. Savings is one thing, but again, I always think about value. All right, Robin.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Want to make sure that we've got just a few minutes to look at the poll results and see if there are any questions in the chat channel. Obviously, as Ben mentioned, executive reporting, having that concept of, unit costs, cost of goods, depending on your vernacular of how you want to refer to it. Understanding, how much is the cost of those services as it relates to, if those services increase or decrease, are you getting economies of scale, etc. Obviously having the ability to do budgeting, forecasts, look at trend lines, understand where costs are being exceeded, etc., but do it early on. We also talked about tagging being a pillar to getting a lot of FinOps accurate and working in your environment. So obviously another place where we can do dashboard and reporting is around tag compliance. Understanding what is my tag compliance coverage by percentage. What are my big hitting resources that are incorrectly tagged or they're not tagged at all. Being able to, take that data and make sure that as things are being deployed in the environment, so as part of that CI/CD infrastructure as code, apply policies to make sure that new tagging problems are not introduced into the environment. So once again, fixing tagging at a point in time is great, but you're going to start seeing that drift, as Ben talked about, unless you actually have procedures and policies in place to make sure it doesn't reoccur. What we're looking at here is an example of a policy in our governance engine around tagging. It's making sure that tags are present. It's making sure that, things like it is a valid email address, it's formatted correctly. The environment that someone's actually put in as the environment tag value is actually part of our curated list, and they haven't fat fingered something in their Terraform code. Okay, so having those types of checks happen in an automated fashion. We also have the ability to actually look at the live environment, so that what I would refer to as the brownfield, what we're having to deal with when we first, get into a customer's environment. Okay, so having additional policies where we can see if, tags are not present, they're absent against specific resource types, filtering down to specific areas, be it subscriptions, accounts, resource groups, other tags are present, etc. And then automating the fixing. So actually having the ability to go ahead and write policies where we can fix tags. Okay.
Love that.
We also talked a little bit about cost attribution and doing shared costs. Okay. So tagging can be perfect, but, and I used this example before, that there are certain, cloud costs that you can't tag, right? So here we've got an example of an AWS support contract, and how are we going to allocate that across our various lines of business, okay? And you can see here, we're actually doing a fixed percentage-based cost allocation here. Okay, so we're actually giving marketing 30% of the support contract cost. We could actually base it on their cloud spend. That would be a proportional split. And very rarely do I see people do an equal split. That would literally be like saying everyone gets 20%. So quality or equal, not used very much. Proportional more so, but then driving it from an external metric potentially is another way of doing it.
That's a great one too. Being able to break that out is so nice. And again, being able to attribute who's spending what on this shared cost is such a valuable thing.
Yeah. Making recommendations easy to consume and tying them into vehicles that are already in your environment. You send someone an email saying do something, they've got to be really committed, if they're busy in their day, to actually look at a recommendation and action it. So tying it into your Jira, your ServiceNow, where there's potential for an SLA there, but making sure it's also a quality recommendation. So, for example, if I came into this recommendation, which is around resizing the compute on a Kubernetes infrastructure, okay? Currently configured with 9 nodes of N2 Standard 4. We're making recommendations to go with a newer instance type and less of them, but a slightly larger size. But the potential, for monthly savings of $240, or maybe move to Spot for even bigger savings. But also for the FinOps team to be able to drive what's actually going to get recommended here. Okay, so maybe we're trying to push to move off Intel onto other forms of Graviton or AMD, etc. Okay, so being able to control what's actually going to get pushed, or maybe pushing instance types where we're getting an extra discount from the cloud vendor. Okay. Other thing on recommendations, and some of our most successful customers implement this. They do gamification. So the concept of being able to show teams, well, how efficient are you? If I look at Team C here, they're operating at 92, 95% efficiency. That should guilt some of their other teams here that are doing far less efficient usage of the cloud resources. Okay. Also, there are aspects of FinOps that are truly in control of the FinOps team. They don't require that much access or involvement with organizations outside. One of the things that we do is we do commitment orchestration. Okay, this is where we're actually making those interactive purchase, or for us, convertible RI transitions on a daily basis. Okay, I've never seen an organization that's going to do 62 convertible RI actions in a day in a manual fashion. Okay, so having an engine that literally is reviewing your compute usage every day of the year, okay, and making sure that the goals that you've set are reached from a coverage perspective. This is not fake data here. This is an example. Well, I say example. This is actually one of our customers. They set their coverage for a little bit, just over 90%, and our automation keeps them there. Okay, but in a risk-adverse fashion, because we're using convertible RIs. At this point in time, I have a few more slides to show, but I think we're out of time, Ben. So I'm going to stop presenting, and we might want to lead to a wrap up here.
All righty. I think Jared, was there any poll questions that we had out there? Oh, here we go. Check out the polls we haven't already. Let's see. All right. You're right. We did go quick through this. So you know what? I think one of the things I like, and when you think about that, Robin, if you can speak just maybe a minute about that, being able to set that threshold, like you talked about the customer saying, we want to keep this at 90% or greater. What does that look like? How challenging is that to set up?
So we'll actually interrogate the history within the account. So we're actually looking at the types of, movement across the compute usage. And so we make a recommendation out of the box on where that should be set to. But the customer, as I always say, it doesn't matter what algorithms or AI we're using, that there are always going to be large future business initiatives that are just not available, to our product. For example, if the customer knows, the utility company I was referring to, they're moving out of a data center into Azure, completely net new, big increase in Azure spend. We don't know about that, so we make our recommendations. We say, here's where we think you should set it to, but there is always that human aspect to it. Okay. So we'll give them, we'll review all the historic, we'll trend it, but it's still, the human element is still required.
You know what? And that's a good thing. But when you can move it away from having to focus and just be more oversight, that's where the true value comes, right? Because the human should be doing oversight. Again, something like Commitment Orchestrator, you're taking away all that work and all that time. So that's a great point. Folks, I think we are at time. 11. Yep, 11. I think we're top of the hour. Jared, I think we're good.
All right. Ben, Robin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's been a pleasure having you. And for everyone that is on the webinar with us, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to Ben and Robin. It's been great having you answer the polls, using the chat. It's been wonderful. Before we close out, I do want to remind you there is a survey on the left side of your screen in the resource section. We've also got all the handouts. Your input is invaluable if you could take that survey. It's 4 quick, easy questions. And once again, this program was recorded. You will receive an email in your inbox shortly after we conclude. And before we close out, Ben, Robin, if you have any final remarks, go ahead and do that. And while they're doing that, if you guys haven't checked out the polls, they're also on the left side of your screen. So go ahead and just do that. And then we'll finish closing out. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Jared, so much. And Robin, thank you for your time. It's always great to do these things with you and even work with you in other capacities. My closing would be, get out there, start looking at opportunities, start looking at solutions. I would obviously recommend Harness, but do your due diligence and see what you need, see what's important to you. One of the things, like I said earlier, value add is that we like to do maturity assessments and help organizations grow in their space. It is something that you can reach out and work with us on, and that will meet you where you're at and help you understand what does it look like to go forward. There's no cost to it. There's nothing that we're trying to necessarily sell you, but what we're trying to do is change the way you think about optimization and FinOps in itself. Robin?
No, thank you, Ben. I think, you covered it, and always a pleasure to present with you. And Jared, thank you for hosting.
Absolutely. Thank you both, and have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Take care, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.